Am I the a-hole for only ordering a $4 drink at dinner and refusing to split the check with my freeloading friends? I, 27M, have been part of a tight-knit friend group since college, about 8 people total. We've been friends for years, so there's a lot of history, but not all of it is good. Over time, I've noticed that to people in the group Susan, 27F, and Greg, 28M, have turned into complete leeches. Whenever we go out for food or drinks, they always pull the same stunt. They'll order the most expensive stuff on the menu, make a big show of it, and when the bill comes, they suddenly remember their financial troubles and expect everyone else to chip in for their portion. They're not struggling financially either. I've seen Susan with designer handbags and Greg bragging about his new gadgets, so it's just obvious they're taking advantage of our generosity. It's been happening for years, and most of us have either been too polite or too non-confrontational to call them out on it. I've watched them pull this stunt so many times, and honestly, I'm tired of being guilt-tripped into paying for their indulgent meals. But every time I brought it up, the rest of the group, especially Dan 28M, brushed it off and told me to let it go. Dan, in particular, seems to have a soft spot for them, saying that they're going through a rough patch financially, even though they're clearly not. Anyway, last weekend, Dan told me about a casual dinner some of us were planning. At first, I hesitated because I knew Susan and Greg would be there. I even told Dan straight up that I didn't want to come if they were going to pull their usual trick. But Dan, being the peacekeeper he always is, convinced me to just come for once. He said I should set my feelings aside and just try to enjoy the night. He promised it would be fine, and I figured, okay, maybe I'm overreacting. Plus, I didn't want to cause drama in the group, so I agreed to come. The night started off fine. There were 6 of us in total: me, Dan, Susan, Greg, and 2 other friends. We were at this mid-range restaurant, not super fancy, but nice enough that people were ordering meals that averaged around $40. We were all chatting, catching up, and it was a decent time until it came time to order. Everyone places their orders, and I watch as most people pick relatively modest meals. Then, it's Susan and Greg's turn. True to form, they each ordered the most expensive items on the menu. Greg got some kind of surf and turf that was close to $200, and Susan ordered this extravagant seafood platter that was around the same price. No surprises there. Then, the waiter turns to me, and everyone's eyes are on me. But instead of ordering food, I just casually pick up the menu, point to the $4 Miller Lite, and tell the waiter that's all I'm having. I wasn't hungry, to be honest, but more importantly, I didn't feel like being part of yet another split check scam. Dan looked at me, puzzled, and asked why I wasn't ordering any food. I simply told him I'd lost my appetite. I could see Greg and Susan exchanging glances, but I didn't care. Then, something interesting happened. 2 of our other friends, clearly catching on to what I was doing, got up and canceled their food orders as well. They decided to just stick to drinks, too. Now it was just Dan, Susan, and Greg who had ordered full meals. The food eventually came out, and I watched as Greg and Susan dug into their luxurious meals. The conversation started to die down a bit, and I could sense tension building, especially when the check arrived. Greg, like clockwork, reached for the bill and casually asked the waiter to split it 6 ways. I could see the gears turning in his head, expecting everyone to chip in for his extravagant meal like always. But this time, I wasn't going to let it slide. I stood up and corrected him, telling the waiter to split the check 3 ways instead, 1 for me and the other 2 friends who only had drinks, and 1 for those who actually ordered food. Greg was completely baffled and asked why we weren't splitting it evenly like we always do. That's when I reminded him that 3 of us hadn't eaten any food, so we weren't going to pay for meals we didn't order. Greg started getting defensive, saying that we've always split the bill equally no matter what, but I wasn't having any of it. Dan, who had ordered a relatively modest $50 meal, was left to cover the majority of the remaining bill since Greg and Susan's extravagant meals had pushed the total way up. I'll never forget the look on his face when he picked up that receipt and saw that his portion of the bill was $146.98. Yes, I remember the exact number. I didn't feel bad, though. I calmly slid a $10 bill towards the check, which covered my drink and a bit of tip, said goodbye to everyone, and walked out. I figured that was the end of it. But the next morning, I woke up to a barrage of angry texts from Greg and Susan, accusing me of being an a-hole for not ordering food and forcing them to pay more than they had budgeted for. Apparently, they thought I should have helped cover their bill like usual, even though they were the ones who splurged. I couldn't help but laugh at their audacity. Their expensive steaks alone were worth more than what they paid in the end, but sure, I'm the bad guy here. I also got several texts from Dan, who was pretty upset with me. He said that, if I didn't want to come, I should have just stayed home instead of pulling that stunt and leaving him stuck with such a big check. I get where he's coming from, but I was tired of being dragged into Greg and Susan's nonsense. Don's always been the type to help them out financially, even though they're blatantly using him, and I was done playing along. For some extra context, the restaurant has a separate bar tab for drinks, which is why our drinks were on a different bill, so there was no confusion about splitting drinks and food. So the waiter splitting the check at all was already a rare win. Also, for anyone wondering, the prices I've mentioned are in AUD, so if you're looking at this from the US, the amounts would be slightly different after conversion. As for Dan, he could have easily asked Greg and Susan to transfer him the money if he really wanted to. But Dan, being the bleeding heart that he is, always tries to help them out through their so-called financial hardships, even though we all know they're just freeloaders. Honestly, I admit what I did was petty, and maybe it was a bit immature, but I was fed up. If Dan wants to spend his money on them, that's his choice, but I refuse to keep footing the bill for people who clearly don't need the help. And yeah, Don's a good friend, one of my closest, but he's completely blind when it comes to Susan and Greg. I was just trying to get him to see the reality of the situation. Was it a petty way to do it? Sure, but after years of this, I felt like it was the only way to make my point. So, am I the a-hole?